Hey everyone, Grzegorz Baran here. None of any known substances absorb 100% of light, as well as none ever reflects full 100% of it back. Therefore, nothing is ever 100% black and nothing is ever 100% white, since digital PBR materials are designed to mimic reality in physically based digital rendering systems. They need to follow same physical principles that apply to their real physical counterparts. Color and brightness are very perceptual and contextual. Let's pick this rectangular stripe in the middle of this image as an example. Even if it's purely solid and uniform, the background context changes its perception. Therefore, for most of us it looks brighter on one side and darker on the opposite one. But it looks as uniform solid gray on both sides as soon as the background context is gone. And now, even if we know it's solid, as soon as the background context is back, it doesn't look uniform anymore. It's just a simple example, but it proves the point that eyeballing any luminance or color values can be very tricky and brings risk of value misinterpretation. It can be a serious problem when it comes to PBR material reconstruction. This way, we risk getting incorrect and unnatural light response from digital surfaces in any PBR rendering system, as well as we are going to struggle with materials cross-consistency in 3D scenes. Values we eyeball usually look fine only without wider context in fixed lighting environments, but they quickly feel off when seen in a different context under different digital lighting conditions. Therefore, when it comes to PBR materials, we should avoid eyeballing for any color or luminance values and base them on already verified and calibrated ones. So, what value should we use if we want to create something white? Should we just pull luminance up to its maximum? Unfortunately, it's not as simple, and finding this value is the main subject of this video. I'm going to pick some substances everyone considers as white and measure them with a professional color spectrometer. By getting these values right, we should be able to define the safe range we can apply when it comes to their PBR counterparts. Actually, it took me over 6 months to collect all samples I considered as necessary for this research. I purchased most of samples on my own, but some, very rare and hard to get, were gifted to me. So, while this video is not sponsored or influenced by anyone in any way, I would really like to thank to Pro-Lite Technology UK for providing me the physical sample of Spectralon. Pro-Lite is the official UK and Ireland distributor of Labsphere Spectralon, and Spectralon is considered as one of the whitest non-emissive substances that exist. I also would like to thank to Nix Sensor for providing sample of extremely rare white substance, the Gore DRP. It's another non-emissive substance which falls into category of whitest non-emissive existing substances. Nix Sensor is a Canadian company that develops color measurement tools, and it is their flagship color spectrometer, Spectra 2, which I use on a daily basis to reliably measure color values. This is the color spectrometer which I'm going to use for color measurements in this video. I would like to thank to my colleague Amelia Evershed for providing samples of probably the whitest natural rock from the famous White Cliffs of Dover. And last but not least, I would like to thank all of you who purchased my PBR Color Reference List, as it helped to co-fund this video, but also this entire research. And it wouldn't be possible without you folks. So once again, very big thanks. I will drop link to this list for those interested into getting their own copy, as every single purchase matters and helps to co-fund this research. This is the plan for this video. Get some samples and check them all under ultraviolet light to see how much of optical brightening agent was used to make them look brighter. Find out what actually happens to the substance which contains an OBA agent if was left exposed to the daylight for a couple of months. Measure and compare all samples together to find the whitest white, as well as analyze surface structure of each to better understand their light response by observing them illuminated by incident light under 20 times magnification. And similar to my previous video, I'm going to try to set white paper on fire by exposing it to the strong light. For those who have no time or patience to watch the entire video, here is a quick summary. Gore DRP is definitely the brightest non-fluorescent surface I ever measured. It's almost 100% white in both linear and sRGB space. Spectralon is also extremely white, but it's a volume scatterer, so appears darker during measurements. Whiteness looks different depending on spectral composition of light used to illuminate the surface, and same substances might look brighter in a daylight while darker if seen when illuminated just by artificial light, especially these which contain OBA agent. We can expose OBA substances easily by observing them under ultraviolet light. OBA substances are chemically less stable and decay quicker when exposed to the light. Basically, the OBA agent fades and in result decolorizes substances it was applied to over time. This is how individual substances look like when magnified 20 times under incident light illumination. I would recommend to consider value of 245 in sRGB color space, which is at 0.96 in float, as the whitest white for PBR materials. Even if it's not the actual whitest value I measured, this is certainly the believable one, as can be found in our surroundings. Unlike a black one, I actually struggle to set white piece of paper on fire, even by exposing it to the direct sun through strong magnifying glass. And basically that's it. For those who have more curiosity and like to delve deeper into the subject, please keep watching the rest of the video. If you like it and would like to see even more content like this one, I would really appreciate dropping a comment, thumbs up and subscribing to my channel. I would also appreciate any reshares of this video so it doesn't get lost in the depth of YouTube. Big thanks to everyone who did that already, as it really helps to keep this channel alive and motivates to create even more content like this one. White is not a color, it's all visible colors combined together. We can split white light into individual color components, for example by passing it through prism. It happens because each individual color has different wave frequency and wavelength, therefore bends under slightly different angle and leaves the prism shifted. Same happens when the light passes through water drops scattered in the air, which results with rainbows. Light is not a particle, but it's a wave. To understand it better, we can use analogy to water waves. Water waves travel through water medium, similar way as sound waves travel through air and light waves travel through electromagnetic field. Similar to water waves we can easily observe in a water and recognize their size, form and shape, light waves also have certain length, frequency and energy. The human eye is virtually light blind and perceives only a very tiny portion of the entire light spectrum. We are able to see waves which are only between 400 to 700 nanometers long. Any shorter or longer waves are totally out of our visual perception. So while gamma radiation, ultraviolet, infrared, heat, microwaves or even radio waves are also part of the same electromagnetic spectrum as the red, green or blue light are, human eye is totally blind for them. An ideal physical white substance would be the one which fully reflects all visible but also invisible for us light back. In reality, nothing ever fully reflects 100% of radiation, as well as never absorbs full 100% of it. So, when the light hits the surface, always some of it gets reflected, while some gets absorbed. The more light gets reflected, the brighter the surface appears. Light waves carry an energy, which is being passed to the surface during absorption process and mostly turned into heat. The more light gets absorbed, the darker the surface appears and the warmer it gets. Some substances convert light energy during absorption not just into heat, but also back into visible for human radiation. Such process appears as self-illumination and is related to fluorescence. Substances with such physical properties are often being used to make certain products appear whiter than they naturally are. Substances used for artificial brightening are called Optical Brightening Agents, or OBA for short. Nothing ever comes from nothing, and light ray emission isn't an exception. Substances with such properties convert energy from invisible for human range back into visible spectrum. In result, while they appear brighter for human eye, in reality they are much darker but outside of visible range. The higher the energy of electromagnetic wave, the greater the probability of causing fluorescence. Blue color, which has 400 nanometers long wavelength, carries almost twice as much energy as the red one, which is 700 nanometers long. Waves of length between 100 to 400 nanometers are considered as ultraviolet radiation. If we pick the wave at 200 nanometers as an example, which is totally invisible for us, we can easily estimate that it carries almost 4 times more energy as the red color does. Earth's atmosphere filters out most of high-energy radiation, with most of ultraviolet light included. But there is still some of ultraviolet light left unfiltered, and this radiation is often utilized to make substances look brighter, invisible to human range. It's worth to notice that any high-frequency radiation is harmful to living species. The higher the frequency and the shorter the wavelength, the more energy it carries and the more harmful it gets. So, while it's obvious for everyone that even short exposition to gamma radiation is dangerous, ultraviolet light isn't an exception here. Of course, ultraviolet carries much less energy to gamma radiation, but it's still enough to permanently damage living cells if they are exposed to it. The trickiest thing about ultraviolet light is that it seems like nothing to us, like it doesn't exist. And this is why it's being called as a black light, as we simply can't see it. If we see anything when it comes to this torch, it's because it's not high-grade tool, and while it's designed to emit light at 365 nanometers wavelength, it actually leaks some closer to the visible range too. So if we flash a powerful high-grade UV torch directly into our eyes, we won't see a thing. The torch is going to look for us like it's off. Even if we flash at full power, which if emitted as visible light would glow like the sun and blind us, because our eyes cannot see it, they won't squint to protect themselves from excess of light, as for them there is nothing. This is something what makes ultraviolet light even more dangerous to our eyes. Therefore, every time we are exposed to ultraviolet light, we should always wear protective glasses and clothing. And under no circumstances should we ever look directly into a UV light source, as it causes permanent and irreversible damage to our eyesight. What we see when it comes to ultraviolet is not the ultraviolet light itself, but fluorescence of certain substances triggered by its invisible energy. Basically, all substances, when treated with high energy radiation, absorb it by re-emitting some of this energy in form of heat, but for some, radiation is being emitted back into visible for humans 400 to 700 nanometers range spectrum, which we perceived as substance glowing. In result, such substance can appear brighter than 100%, the same way as any glowing bulb is, as they simply not just reflect, but additionally illuminate its own light. While OBAs can make substances look brighter, there are many disadvantages to using them. OBA can cause skin irritation, rashes, and allergic reactions. It also looks differently depending if the light source contains or not some ultraviolet component, like the daylight does. In result, shifting colors toward blue or yellow depending on the invisible for us light composition. Another common downside of OBA is it has very short lifespan. It basically decays when exposed to light, and in result decolorizes the substance it was applied to for good. So while it is okay if applied to a cheap printer paper where increased contrast improves overall text readability, while the individual pages aren't really exposed to the light for longer, we should not apply it to the paper we plan to print colorful pictures on to hang them on the wall or keep for longer, as these will fade and get yellowish over time. OBA is also quite easy to be washed out when exposed to water or common cleaning substances, as it's not very resistant to any mechanical treatment. And all of these are the reason why highest quality premium products avoid to use them, and why producers of quality paper advertise there as a non-OBA one. Unfortunately, making things whiter without OBA comes at some cost, which is reflected in the product price. White-looking non-OBA paper can be many times more expensive to the standard OBA one. The easiest way to check how much optical brightening agent was used to artificially brighten a substance is to observe it under ultraviolet light. The more they glow, the more OBA they contain. And this is something we are going to do later. So there are different qualities of white. The best Y is the one which isn't dependent on composition of light used to illuminate it. Therefore doesn't look differently when it's seen in a daylight or artificial light, but stays white all the time regardless. It's also the one which is the brightest in both visible but also outside of visible spectrum range. But for this research we aim to find the whitest value as we usually perceive, so we can apply it when trying to reproduce the brightest substances in our PBR materials creation workflow. Luckily, Nix Spectra 2 color spectrometer can measure color of materials in both UV and non-UV modes. Spectra 2 measures colors of substances simulating their light response when being illuminated under standard outdoor daylight, which contains ultraviolet component below 420 nanometers, but also allows to measure color seen under filtered non-UV artificial light by simulating such. The mode with the UV is called M1, while the one without it is called M2. While usually it is not a big deal and there is no much difference for most of substances, it actually might differ for the whitest ones which utilize OBA component to look brighter. Therefore, while we are going to use both measurement modes for such, we are gonna use their brightest appearance for this comparison. To be able to score individual materials in clear and transparent way, and to be able to easily tell how much white certain substance is in this comparison, I introduced term of whiteness. It essentially tells how white something is, therefore how many percent of light it receives bounces back. I calculated the whiteness in similar way as the blackness for my previous video, just in the opposite way. Since the color spectrometer outputs values in gamma space, to make whiteness linear, we have to convert them back into linear space, which I did with this equation. The higher the value, the brighter the substance is. 100% of whiteness means ideal white with no absorption at all, while 0% of whiteness would mean pure black. Since albedo of PBR materials doesn't operate in linear space, I still kept all RGB values in their native gamma space and presented them this way. Since different apps use different format for color, I additionally split them into such two. So each measurement is going to be described by linear whiteness level, but additionally also a set of individual color values in gamma space, as sRGB in 0 to 255 range and float in 0 to 1 range. And I believe it's the fair amount of color and luminance information to describe all individual samples. These are substances I collected and which we are going to use for this comparison. Gore DRP diffuse reflector. It's the world's most diffuse light reflecting flexible material. According to technical specification, Gore has very flat and stable reflectance curve, also out of visible color range. Gore material is engineered with a proprietary membrane of expanded polytetrafluoroethylene, in short EPTFE, a stable microporous structure that consists of multiple polymetric nodes interconnected by fibrils. This structure results in a high number of randomly oriented surfaces between air and the EPTFE material. At each air to EPTFE interface, light is bent and diffused. This high degree of reflectance means that Gore diffuse reflector does not absorb measurable energy. It also does not degrade or discolor, therefore maintain its high level of reflectance over time. The sample I received is very delicate and dense very easily. It's allophobic, which means that can be touched with bare fingers and fingerprints shouldn't affect its performance. It feels more compacted and less volumetric to the Spectralon, which is the next sample. Spectralon is also a fluoropolymer and in this matter is very similar to Gore DRP material, just processed differently. It's sintered PTFE, which is the highest reflectance diffuse material. Spectralon is a volume scatterer, so the more depth up to 7 mm, the higher the reflectance. Therefore, my concern when it comes to its measurement is that its measurement result might be slightly lower, as some of light used to sample its surface is going to leak sideways through its volume instead of getting back directly to the spectrometer sensor. We can see that if we put a torch on the sample by observing volumetric glow on its sides. This is the light leakage which never gets back to the sensor. As a substance, it feels very durable and sturdy. Unlike Gore DRP, it's not olophobic, therefore shouldn't be ever touched with bare fingers. While it feels very solid as material, it is soft enough to be manually sanded or cut with a knife and machined into the form we need to. Sintered PTFE can be also incorporated with absorbers to generate grayscale useful in some applications. What's amazing is that this material is near to perfect Lambertian reflector, which means that light incident is reflected into the full hemisphere above the surface with no specular, mirror-like reflection. Similar to Gore DRP, it has very high reflectance in extremely wide 250 to 2500 nanometers range, so it's still extremely wide way outside of visible spectrum. The next material we are going to analyze is a piece of very generic white plastic. In this case, I picked the Kefir's bottle made of HDPE. HDPE is a high-density polyethylene. I picked bottle cap as it's flat and small, therefore easier to measure. Also, the thickness of the cap seems to be thicker than the thickness of the sidewall of the bottle itself. That might help preventing some light loss after it passes through the substance volume. The next substance to be used in this comparison is a standard, glossy and reflective white acrylic panel, which I consider as another very common piece of plastic in this comparison. Since the color and luminance of measurements depend on the way the light reflects from the surface, rough surfaces usually appear brighter to the polished ones. To measure how much difference different roughness levels make when it comes to white, I sanded a few spots with sandpaper. I used different grit and pressure to achieve different roughness levels. So, other than an original glossy and very reflective surface, I also created a part which represents polished acrylic, just to the level which is just non-glossy and non-reflective, and another one which we can consider as extremely rough. Since we deal with the white paints on a daily basis, I considered it as an obvious choice and I picked 3 white paints for this comparison. I ordered white 2.0 paint from Culture Hustle, mostly because they claim it to be the whitest paint in the universe. Sadly, the delivery was delayed 6 months. While available in stock all this time, for some reason I couldn't get it. To compare, Black 4.0 I ordered for my previous video arrived within a single week from the purchase. Conspiracy theory aside, I was told that they are developing a new, better formula and don't want to send me the old one. I decided to wait and put this video on hold, especially that I got extremely curious about their paint after finding that their Black 4.0 wasn't the blackest paint as they claimed at all. Luckily, after 6 months the paint arrived and I was ready to prepare the sample. To make sure that spectrometer reading will be as accurate and reliable as possible, I used a non-OBA thick Strathmore Bristol paper as a paint base. Next, I covered it with 2 separate paint layers. The second layer was added over 2 days after the first one was applied. The good side of the 6 months long delay was that it gave me enough time, 6 months, to properly test the process of OBA degradation when exposed to the daylight. But more about that later. The next paint I decided to compare was the generic, cheap, standard white spray, which I purchased on Amazon multiple times already. It's called Plastic Coat 3100. It's the same brand and type of paint I used in my search for the blackest black, just the white version of it. I don't really expect much from it, expect being waterproof and kind of, let's say, whitish, but I believe it might be interesting to use it as another reference for some generic whites. Since it's spray, it's quite easy to apply. The sample was made exactly the same way as the previous one. I coated the piece of Strathmore Bristol paper with 2 separate paint layers. The second layer was added 2 days after the first one was applied. White correction fluid by Tip X is another substance which still might fall into paint category. It's an old school substance commonly used to correct written errors made on paper by painting over them. I found it in a store while I was looking for white paper, and since it was just 4 pounds, I decided to add it to this comparison. The sample for measurements was made the same way as the previous two, with 2 separate coatings applied to Strathmore Bristol paper 2 days apart. The fourth sample is also paint related, but it isn't the sample I made. It's probably the whitest swatch from RAL K5 semi-matte color swatches. This exact swatch is called Traffic White 9016. These RAL swatches are commonly used for visual color matching. Essentially, if we want to match paint or analyze the color, we put them next to the subject and find the closest match. Each color swatch has its own name written on the backside, and similar to X-Rite color checker clips, is pre-measured and officially known. I bet everyone considers white paper as the most common reference of white. Originally, paper is made of wooden pulp and has wooden color, so since it's yellowish by nature, it needs some whitening treatment to look white. Companies keep their whitening process in secret, especially these which claim not to use any OBA agent. Therefore, I consider paper as an interesting subject for this comparison and decided to collect and compare 4 different types of it. Common, cheap, standard office paper, which surely fully utilizes OBA technology to look brighter and provide better contrast between black toner and the background. Of course, due to the OBA used, it doesn't maintain print quality for long, but I don't think anyone expects that from that cheap printer paper. Since I believe that the toilet paper is another very common type of paper everyone uses, I decided to include it in this comparison too. To be precise, I picked a Springforce brand I found in Tesco store. Next is the Pacific Inkjet paper, which claims to be OBA free. I believe this is probably the reason why it is so much more expensive to standard paper sheets. This is the type of paper we use if we want our prints to last, don't fade, and maintain original print colors over time when exposed to the daylight. Strathmore Bristol paper is another brand which products claim to be OBA free, therefore it is also way more expensive to the standard office paper type. Since it's significantly thicker and OBA free, I decided to use it as a base for all paint samples we use in this comparison. Similar to paper, artificial brightening is also commonly used in textile industry to make fabrics white. To analyze the difference between naturally white fabrics and the brightened ones, I purchased 2 types of white natural cotton. One to sample a pure natural white cotton without any artificial enhancements, and another one, also a natural one, but this time brightened with an OBA agent to look white. I consider white flowers as an interesting link to nature's whites. A white we can find in nature on a daily basis, therefore potentially extremely useful as a contextual color reference. I measured many flowers so far and found rose petals to be the whitest one. So for this comparison, I picked the whitest, non-artificially brightened white rose flowers I found in a store. I planned to include even more flowers, but since it took me 6 months to collect all these samples and I am recording this video basically during winter, all flowers are purchased and collected didn't make it. So to get a substance which can represent whitest whites in the category of vegetation, I repurchased another rose once again directly before this video recording and measured its white petals. The white cliffs of Dover Rock seem to be the brightest rock type I ever seen and measured. It's composed of chalk and soft white finely grained limestone. I consider it as the best reference for whitest rock surface type. Its white color should be probably considered as the brightest value for any rock, and no other rock albedo values should be ever brighter. Basically, all other rocks I considered as white before are significantly darker when compared to this one. I grinded part of it down to create a sample and get even more reliable measurement. Since semi-solids, liquids and powders are typically challenging to measure accurately, I also used a special dedicated slide to prepare the sample and measure it with a special chamber adapter. I have heard that some folks use salt as a white reference for white balance setting to save on white balance cards or color checker, and since it definitely falls into category of common white looking substance, substances, I decided to include salt in this comparison too. Since such substance can be very tricky to be measured properly, I also used a dedicator for such substance type measurement slide, so it can be measured with a special chamber adapter too. To make this comparison even more comprehensive, I included a sample of the brightest wood I was able to find. It's certainly not white, but I believe it makes a good reference for this visual comparison to other whites. The wood sample comes from the quarter-figured European sycamore veneer. The last subject I would like to include in this comparison is the brightest clip of the X-Rite Color Checker Passport. I consider Color Checker Passport as an extremely useful, reliable and very handy color reference tool I use for many years, mostly to correct the white balance and adjust luminance levels. What makes Color Checker so useful is that values of each clip are officially known and recognized by many photo editing apps, what helps to automate color calibration process. Unfortunately, nothing lasts forever, so do Color Checker. Its swatches get dirtier and fade over time and lose their designated color and luminance accuracy. This is why every color checker has its expiration date and is recommended to be replaced every 2 years. The whitest clip of the color checker is made to be at sRGB 241 for red, 242 for green and 235 for blue. Since the color checker I use here is almost 3 years old and got through a lot, while still can be very useful as a visual reference, its values might be slightly off. Of course, we are going to measure how off they are. I measured way more white samples for this comparison, but I decided to stick just to these to keep this video shorter. All of these, but also additional sample values, were added to my PBR Color Reference List in its recent update. And these are all substances together. From top left, raw swatch, natural white cotton, enhanced white cotton, white roses, white plastic cap, salt, chalk rock from White Cliffs of Dover, toilet paper, white acrylic panel, piece of white paper painted with correction fluid, Pacific inkjet paper, Strathmore Bristol non-OBA paper, standard office paper with OBA, piece of white paper painted with super matte white spray, piece of white paper painted with white 2.0 paint from Culture Hustle, quarter-figured European sycamore veneer, X-Rite color checker, Spectralon, and the Gore DRP. But before we get into measurement results, let's illuminate them with the ultraviolet light to find out how much of optical brightening agent was used for each to make them whiter. And as we already know, use of OBA makes color to look slightly different under different light, depending on its composition and brightening agent age, as brightening agent decays when exposed to the light decolorizing substance it was applied to. This is how these substances look in a daylight. Let's observe them when illuminated by the high-quality artificial LED light with the CRI index over 96. And this is how they look like when seen in a total darkness, just when illuminated with the ultraviolet light at 365 nanometers wavelength. Cheap, standard office paper glows like crazy as it contains a lot of optical brightening agent. Really, a lot of OBA substance was also clearly used to brighten the white cotton. Surprisingly, white 2.0 paint also contains some of OBA to make their paint look brighter. Strathmore Bristol paper seems to use some of it, even if they state that it doesn't and advertise it as an OBA-free product. Clearly not much, but definitely it contains some. To be honest, I expected much more OBA from the toilet paper, as some other toilet papers brands I observed under UV before were glowing way more. But I guess it depends on the toilet paper brand, and this one clearly doesn't contain much. White 2.0 paint from Culture Hustle seems to be the only paint with such substantial amount of OBA. I guess as they advertised, they just did everything in their power to make their paint as bright as only possible in visible spectrum range. Let's actually test what is the level of OBA decay we are talking about and analyze two substances, one made with OBA to be brighter and one which is OBA free. I was really curious about the actual impact of OBA, how quickly it fades and how it affects the color when I started working on this video. For this reason, I created a special sample and left it exposed to the outdoor light for a while. Basically, I cut two pieces of paper, one from cheap OBA office paper and the other one from the high quality non-OBA Strathmore Bristol. At this point, I wasn't aware that Strathmore Bristol also seems to use some of the brightening agent. Next, I covered half of each sample with black cardboard and additional piece of white paper, and I left it next to the window so it gets some taste of the British summer for some time. I know it doesn't look very professional, but when I started, I didn't really expect much from this anyway. Fortunately for this exact experiment, a delay caused by White 2.0 delivery led these samples to be exposed for full 6 months. Let's see what happened to them after this time. Just to make it clear, now we observe the sample under decent quality artificial LED light with CRE index around 96, but with no any ultraviolet component in it. So what we are going to see isn't what we would see under the sun. Let's mark exposed sides of both samples with pencil before we remove the cover, just in case there is no much difference after we reveal the covered parts, so at least we can be sure which one was which. And voila! There is clearly some subtle difference, but not very significant, at least not when seen when illuminated with the artificial lighting. Let's bring the UV torch and add 365 nanometers UV component to the equation. The OBA paper clearly lost most of its brightening agent, while the non-OBA doesn't seem to be affected. Let's dim the background light and focus purely on light emission caused by the ultraviolet light instead. As you can see, both samples were affected by outdoor light in exposed areas and faded out. The OBA one significantly, while the non-OBA less. But when it comes to the non-OBA one, there is still some subtle difference. Apparently, Strathmore Bristol paper, which was meant to be 100% OBA free, actually contains some of OBA, which also decayed and resulted with this subtle difference. Let's pick a standard torch now. Similar to previous LED illumination, there's no much difference, which clearly indicates how much impact has the light with the ultraviolet component in it. Let's take both samples outdoor to observe how they look like in a daylight. Now, under the sunlight, which contains some of the ultraviolet light, the unexposed OBA side of the sample significantly stands out to the exposed half. Because the OBA substance was enhancing ultraviolet into blue, with the OBA gone, blue component decreased. Therefore, color balance shifted towards red, making paper to look more yellowish when seen in a daylight. Let's stop eyeballing these samples and just measure them with the Spectra 2 color spectrometer in both illumination modes. M1, which simulates the daylight and includes some ultraviolet component below 425 nanometers, and M2 mode, which doesn't include ultraviolet as it's designed to measure color when seen when illuminated with the artificial indoor illumination. The OBA paper in its original form in a daylight clearly looks brighter. As you can see, it transforms some of the invisible for us ultraviolet component back into visible blue range, making blue brighter even to 100%, reaching almost at 120% in this case. So, white OBA paper seen in a daylight is clearly the whitest one, as it's around 94% white in total. The exposed part of the same OBA paper sample got down to 89% in its exposed part after losing the OBA substance and became the darkest one in here. The non-OBA sample feels much more predictable and stable regardless the exposition from the luminance and color perspective. So the OBA paper clearly lost some of its brightness by being exposed to the daylight for some time, while the non-OBA one doesn't look to be affected much. Now let's take a look on values measured in M2 mode without ultraviolet component. Since this light doesn't include any ultraviolet component anymore, there is no visible radiation that can trigger the brightening agent to glow. Therefore, OBA paper looks just significantly darker and that's it. The non-OBA one, since it doesn't rely on brightening agent, doesn't look affected by this change and still looks same bright with no much difference. The conclusion here is that some substances which utilize the optical brightening substances might look brighter in certain lighting conditions, usually outdoor in a daylight, but they fade quickly over time. They also might look darker and shifts its color in response to lighting condition change, which technically shouldn't affect them. It doesn't change the fact that OBA actually works, and substances with an OBA agent are significantly brighter, even if the whitening effect isn't permanent and doesn't last. I wanted to cover this subject though, as it's quite tricky to call any substance as the whitest one if it is the whitest just in certain lighting condition, while it's not at all in a different one. White OBA office printer paper certainly falls in that category. Let's go back to our main subject and analyze the brightness of all samples together. To make sure all measurements are as reliable and accurate as possible, I used Nix Sensor's flagship color spectrometer, Nix Spectra 2. I measured them under D65 illuminant and 10-degree observer with multi-point averaging. What means that each measurement was composed of 3 measurements taken from 3 different spots of the same sample, and the final value was based on their average. Since we deal with substances which might include optical brightening agent, therefore look different under different lighting conditions, I measured each sample twice, with and without ultraviolet component. To keep this comparison clear, I won't present both M1 and M2 results if they were close enough and the difference wasn't relevant. I will mark this only if the OBA component made the difference, and since we search for the whitest white, I'm going to consider brightest readings as the final one. Last but not least, to do not risk any light pollution, I measured all samples in a dark environment. And here are the final results. Let's start from the least whitest ones. I also took some time and magnified all these individual samples 20 times, so we can better understand their individual light response and surface structure. Magnified samples were illuminated by incident diffused artificial light with CRI index over 96. And here they are. Natural white cotton, made without use of any brightening agent to make it brighter, is apparently the darkest white substance in this comparison. It reflects 56% of the light, but since absorbs more of blue color, its appearance shifts a lot towards reds and greens, and in result looks yellow. Under 20 times magnification, we can see that its surface is made of maze of yellow pigmented with translucent fibers, which trap light in many ways before releasing the 56% of it back. Sycamore veneer is slightly brighter to cotton and reflects 60% of the light. Same as natural cotton, absorbs more blues than reds and shifts towards yellows even more. This is how it looks when magnified 20 times. It is made of porous and fibrous structural tissue composed of translucent cellulose fibers, which gives it subtle wooden color tone. Similar to the previous substance, the light gets absorbed mostly when passes through them. Salt seems to be way more balanced when it comes to color tone, and by entire 10% brighter to the brightest wood in this comparison. It definitely falls into category of white substances. When magnified, we can see that it's a maze of translucent irregular crystals with neutral color tone. Petals of white rose are even brighter, as they reflect 66% of the light back. So far, the white rose petals are the whitest, non-artificially brightened flower petals I ever measured. This is how rose petals look under magnification. It's actually pretty thin and has a lot of micro holes, which let light to pass through and never come back to observer's eye. Still, the reflected 66% is quite much. The substance of HDPE plastic is almost 10% whiter to salt and reflects almost 80% of the light. 80% of reflectance is definitely in the luminance area, which falls into white's category. When magnified, the substance doesn't look like previous organic translucent traps anymore. It's solid and certainly translucent, but not very reflective. The contact surface look quite irregular to what I expected. I guess this bumpiness makes it matte. This plastic cap absorbs slightly more reds than blues, therefore its color tone shifts slightly towards blue. Correction fluid is another sample which falls in area of 80% whites, but it's better balanced from a color tone point of view. Looks solid and non-translucent when magnified, but also not very reflective. Feels a bit powdery and polluted with a lot of cracks, which might absorb some light. Chalk rock from White Cliffs of Dover also has whiteness on very similar level of 80%. This is the value I would consider as the brightest one for any natural rock. Looks powdery, organic and irregular when magnified. Since it's an organic substance, its color shifts towards red. The toilet paper I measured falls into similar 80% reflectance range as others. Its color is extremely well balanced and doesn't shift much in any direction. From this perspective, feels like a decent reference for white balancing. Since paper is originally made of natural wood fibers diluted in water, it has similar fiber structure to fabrics. Of course, paper fibers are denser and more randomly scattered as the cotton ones, but they are still a very translucent leaky maze which allows some light to pass through to the other side instead of bouncing back. The roughest part of the acrylic panel seems to be the darkest one of others more polished ones here. Looks semi-translucent under magnification. Maybe it looks darker because I accidentally introduced some dirt to it during polishing, or maybe because it's too rough and the light is being bounced under extreme angles and never gets back to the observer. Technically, a rough surface should be brighter. Let's pick the original unpolished part of this acrylic panel, which appears to be almost 1% brighter. It's the one which is the glossiest and the most reflective one. It looks semi-translucent and polished when magnified. Acrylic panel polished to the level when the surface is not very rough yet, but is already not glossy and reflective anymore, looks brighter. This is how it looks when magnified 20 times. Looks slightly more translucent and volumetric to the reflective one. These micro scratches though scatter the light around and, as predicted, more of it bounces back to the observer, therefore appears brighter to the reflective one. This acrylic surface is a good example of surface whiteness dependency on its roughness level. The more reflective the substance, the darker it looks on average. It looks brighter only in glare spots, so under a very certain angle, and that's it. When it's rough, the light scatters and on average more of the light hits the observer. The roughest part in here seems to be an exception. We should better understand this particular light response in here when we observe and compare these three spots under magnification. What we can surely learn from this case is that based on the acrylic panel example, we get 1.5% of reflectance difference depending on how rough the same type of surface is. It might be even more when it comes to darker substances, but it would be a subject for another video. This is the measured value of the whitest X-Rite color checker passport clip. This clip is meant to be at brighter level, and initially it was, but this exact color checker is almost 3 years old and was used a lot. Any substance decays over time and its color fades, and no matter how well cared for, the color checker isn't an exception here. Not to mention that when used, its surface gets scratches but also get in contact with different types of pollution. This is why it was built with expiry date in mind and should be replaced every 2 years. This is how this clip surface looks when magnified 20 times. Looks like some matte paint. Of course, since was used a lot, it seems to be a bit dirty, but it's not that I totally mistreated this color checker and kept it buried in the dirt. Let's compare it to the almost unused one. This is another X-Rite color checker, which, while quite old, hasn't been used almost at all. Since it's in a paper version, it's very fragile, so I use it maybe a few times when I needed something small, but it was mostly kept closed in a storage box. When measured, this color checker, even after years, didn't fade at all and holds proper color values, and the whitest clip is exactly where it should be when measured. Let's take a look how it looks when observed under 20 times magnification. As you can see, there is no much difference other than a few dirt crumbs and subtle scratching. So, while the whitest clip of the old color checker maintains its neutral balance and doesn't shift colors in any way, its actual whiteness level got down by almost 3% to its initial value. It really doesn't matter to me as long as I'm fully aware of that, but such subtle changes might affect the result of automated color profiling, for example. I should probably bring a new one here too, but it wouldn't change much as camera isn't sensitive enough to catch such subtle difference. So for this comparison, let's use the value of a brand new one, but let's keep in mind when we eyeball all these samples here that this exact color checkers white clip is 3% darker to what it should be. The RAL 9016 swatch called white traffic is at 85% of whiteness. It seems to be the whitest swatch from all RAL color swatches I measured, so I guess we can say that 85% of reflectance represents the group of whitest, non-fluorescence and non-OBA semi-matte paints. And this is how it looks under magnification. It's quite solid, non-translucent and bumpy. It's evenly covered and unpolluted. Since it's a semi-matte, in practice it's a bit glossy. Maybe this is why it results with slightly darker values to the next paint, which is generic white matte paint spray from Plasticote. This one also places itself in area of 85% whiteness. It's also extremely well balanced when it comes to color distribution, which I personally find very surprising for such cheap paint. When magnified, looks way more powdery and bumpier to the previous one, which probably makes it more matte and less reflective. I always thought it's actually more yellowish, but maybe because I always used to compare it to the white OBA paper in a daylight. The samples of non-OBA Strathmore Bristol paper and the non-OBA Pacific Inkjet paper are at 91% of whiteness. Since both are non-OBA, they give very similar readings regardless of being measured with or without ultraviolet component. This is the Strathmore Bristol under magnification. Its structure reflects structure of any other paper. Structure of randomly mixed and scattered translucent fibers. It looks like it was bleached to remove original yellowish wooden color, like every paper is. Maybe that exact substance was the one which triggered some of glowing when treated with the ultraviolet light. The Pacific Inkjet paper is slightly brighter, but this one clearly had totally nothing reactive to ultraviolet light at all. Let's magnify it 20 times and see its structure. To be honest, this one doesn't resemble common paper structure. It rather looks like some form of reflective coating used to create glossy and reflective paper surfaces, which is done by applying clay-based surface sealant, but this one feels different and more powdery. Such surface definitely looks like it's a great light scatterer. This paper looks really amazing, and it's so far the brightest non-OBA white paper I measured. Next two samples are much trickier as they are OBA substances. They are significantly brighter in their finest when seen in a daylight, while significantly darker when seen under artificial light. So the white OBA cotton when seen in a daylight with ultraviolet components reaches almost 93% of whiteness. But as soon as we remove ultraviolet component, it gets down to 83%. So it's extremely inconsistent and light dependent. But as said, let's pick each fineness to this comparison and use their highest value here. Since it's a natural but brightened cotton, it has exactly same organized fiber structure. Same as the non-brightened one, its fibers are translucent and is filled with gaps which allow light to pass through or get trapped. It lacks any color and contains a lot of substance which emits blue light when illuminated with the ultraviolet light. Same applies to the standard office printer paper, which is extremely rich in optical brightening agents too. It's even brighter to the brightened cotton. When seen in a daylight, ultraviolet component cranks its perceived whiteness up to 94%. But as soon we remove the component from the equation and observe it under artificial light, the whiteness gets down to the level of 87%. Its structure looks like any other paper structure when magnified. Individual fibers are translucent and composed into random mess. But unlike non-OBA paper, it contains some additional clumped substance. Maybe this is the excess of the actual optical brightening agent which makes this paper so bright. Anyway, let's use its finest version measured under ultraviolet light in this comparison. The next substance which actually makes the third top position in this comparison is the white 2.0 paint from Culture Hustle. The paint reached the level of 96.5% of whiteness. Similar to two previous substances, it clearly utilizes some kind of optical brightening substance to look whiter under the ultraviolet light, but unlike previous OBA substances, it doesn't lose much after we remove the ultraviolet component from the light and still stays incredibly bright. Therefore, it looks very white regardless the illumination type. So, unlike their black 4.0, which unfortunately wasn't the blackest paint as advertised, the white 2.0 is indeed the whitest paint I ever measured. This is how it looks when magnified. Feels non-translucent and powdery like a good light scatterer. It was definitely worth to wait these 6 months for this paint to arrive just to get this value. It maintains the third position in this comparison regardless the illumination type, but let's be consistent and pick its finest. Spectralon takes the second place of the whitest whites, as it seems to be at 98% white. It is really extremely white level for any substance, but since it's a volume scatterer, it might appear darker during measurements. This is how Spectralon looks when magnified. Feels a bit crystal and very translucent for such surface. Its surface looks also uneven, which probably helps with light scattering properties. Gore DRP is the winner here. It's definitely the brightest non-fluorescent substance in this comparison, which reflects almost 100% of light. The first time I measured it, I got even better, almost impossible to any non-fluorescent substance results, but I wasn't able to reproduce them anymore. Similar to Spectralon, it maintains even reflectance way outside of visible range. Unfortunately, I don't have access to any spectrometer that I can use to measure it, at least not yet. This is how Gore DRP looks when magnified 20 times. It feels very solid, soft and reflective, and non-translucent. It's surely not 100% solid as it allows some light to pass through it, but it's definitely not a volume scatterer similar to the Spectralon though. Maybe this is what makes the difference and puts Gore DRP in this position here. Based on these results, we can see that the albedo value for PBR materials that we want to be white cannot and should not be defined by just single fixed value. Whiteness in PBR reconstruction should rather be considered as a range within which specific reflectance level apply for corresponding substance types. I would rather group such whites as safe ones, acceptable and extreme ones. Safe for anything which we consider white with the whitest edge value set by value of the whitest X-Rite color checker clip. This is the group which should be reserved for generic and common white substances like flowers, fabrics or paints we find around on a daily basis. Next would be the group of acceptable whites, which should be reserved for values which, while rare, still can be spotted around in our surroundings. This would be whites like fresh, very white paint or brand new brightened fabric. For such I would use sRGB of 250, which in linear space represent whiteness at 95% of reflectance. Anything above should be considered as extreme, and while possible to exist, such substances don't occur around naturally. So I wouldn't use these extreme values unless we want to reproduce exactly these rare substances. And these are substances like Spectralon or Gore DRP. So when we create a white PBR materials which are meant to simulate reality and we want to create something white, setting it as sRGB 243 should be safe. 250 acceptable in certain cases, but we should never set albedo above value of sRGB 250, at least not if we aim to mimic reality. The easiest way to make sure our whites are correct is to compare them to some pre-measured reference object. The most accurate one is to measure original materials with color spectrometer and use these values as a reference for our albedos. We can also find such values already measured by someone else and simply use the closest match for a certain substance we are trying to digitally recreate. As such, I would actually recommend the PBR reference list I developed over years already, as it contains a lot of carefully measured samples and it's still under development. Just so you know, by getting one, you help to co-fund this research and this PBR list to grow. So once again, big thank you to everyone who purchased a copy already, as I wouldn't be able to go thus far without your support. For those who haven't but still consider getting a copy, I will drop link to this PBR list under the video. Finally, we reached the end of the video, so it's time to answer the final question. Can we set white paper on fire by illuminating it with a strong light? If you watch my previous video about search for the blackest black, we are able to set black substance on fire with a flashlight. It was possible because black looks black because it absorbs most of the light. Absorbed light energy transforms into heat, which makes substance warmer. The darker the substance, the more energy it absorbs. So if we provide a lot of light to the substance which absorbs most of it, we generate a lot of heat, which can end up with a fire. But white works the opposite. Instead of absorbing light, it reflects it back. Therefore, there should be no heat, which can ignite the fire. Let's check it in practice. But unlike in the previous video, let's use really extremely strong source of light, the sun. I prepared two paper samples. One is made of the whitest non-OBA piece of paper we just measured, which is a no OBA Pacific inkjet paper. As we already know, it reflects 90% of the light. And on the opposite side, let's use a piece of black cardboard paper. This exact piece of black paper has whiteness level at 5%, therefore absorbs 95% of the light energy it gets and transforms it into heat. So, while it is not the darkest substance, same as the white sample isn't the whitest one, it's definitely dark enough. Next, let's use the magnifying glass to accumulate as much of the British summer sun in a single spot on each sample as possible. While the British summer sun definitely isn't the strongest one, when focused through magnifying glass, it should be more than enough to set things on fire. As you can see, black piece of paper ignites almost instantly. White seems to be totally invulnerable and didn't even get warm. But let's keep going. No matter what I do and how hard I try, the white piece of paper seems to be totally invulnerable to the light radiation. It just reflects the sun and gets so bright that it's extremely hard to even look at with a naked eye. Finally, at some point, the flame and the heat from the black sample smudged the white one and decreased its brightness. Darker part of the white paper should absorb more light now, and it does. So, as long as I target the dark part of the white paper, I'm able to set it on fire. But there is no way I can ignite the bright white part this way, no matter how long I keep it illuminated through the magnifying glass. So no, I wasn't able to set white non-OBA piece of paper on fire, no matter how hard I tried, while it was extremely easy to ignite the black one instead. The OBA might be trickier and easier to set on fire this way, as it technically absorbs light in invisible ultraviolet spectrum and turns some of it into visible light but some into heat. So OBA substance would actually look black to any species which can perceive the ultraviolet part of the spectrum. This non-OBA white paper was 90% white, therefore was still absorbing 10% of the sun radiation. Imagine trying to heat up Gore DRP this way, which basically reflects 99.7% of the light. Anyway, that's it. I really hope you enjoyed the video and found it interesting. If you like it and want me to create even more content like this one, please give a thumbs up, drop a comment and subscribe to my channel. Big thanks to all of you who did it already, as it really helps and motivates to keep this channel alive. For those interested, I will drop links I mentioned in this video below the video. So big thanks for watching, until the next one. Bye!